Good evening, everybody. Monday morning quarterback, episode 151. Glad to be able to join you guys tonight. And we're going to talk about the difference between a static and a dynamic spring load. Back, I think, episode 143, we talked about softer or stiffer. And on that episode, we broke down, I had an Excel spreadsheet that kind of talked about different spring loads and knowing what your spring load is as a car travels through the corner and its importance. So if you missed that one, go back and catch that one. I got a few questions after that episode on static and dynamic and what exactly that meant. I glazed over it a little too quickly, apparently. So we'll talk about that a little bit tonight, and why it's important to know what that is. And this isn't just pertaining to cars with coilover suspensions, right? So static versus dynamic loads is important for your bump rubbers, torsion bar rates. So all of that stuff becomes important. A lot of times people just think of a coilover application, which is certainly a lot easier to measure it in that application. For those of you joining us tonight, at any time you can ask a question. I'll be happy to answer that, whether it's pertaining to tonight's topic or any other important race topic you have. That's what we're here for. We don't do these every week anymore, but try to do them at least once a month. We'll do them a little more frequently in the wintertime, and a little more interactive, rather than just having to sit here and stare at me. We'll do them out in the shop, and pre-record some more stuff. So thank you for joining us tonight. And again, if you have any questions, fire away, and I'm more than happy to answer those for you. So to get started, a static spring load by definition is a fixed load. So what that means is, as the spring is squished on the car and it's just sitting there statically, that would be your static load. So if it's a 100-pound linear spring and it's compressed, a half of an inch at ride height, it has 50-pound static load roughly. Okay, a dynamic load, or what's considered a dynamic load, is once the spring starts moving. So as it's compressing and extending around the racetrack, that is a dynamic load. And why is that important? Well, one, knowing how much you're traveling in compression and extension is important. We're actually working on some nicer tools. There's a few companies out there that have some stuff available now that are a little more generic and go on a bunch of different shocks. RE Suspension has a bunch of that stuff that can work. If after watching tonight's video you want something in the moment, we're working on a couple things that are a little more particular to our shocks, to fit our shocks nicer, where you can measure compression and extension on the car. Important on the wing sprint car side, where you're running a bump rubber, to know how much you're squeezing that bump rubber and then how much you're coming off of it. And then, on the pavement side, knowing exactly how much we're traveling in the center of the corner. So we know what our exact dynamic max spring load is, whether we're needing to go softer or stiffer, if that makes sense. So knowing your compression and extension will be paramount in determining whether you're going to need to go stiffer or softer. As I mentioned in that previous Monday morning quarterback, I believe it's episode 143, it's titled Softer or Stiffer. What I explained is again, for round numbers, if you have a 100-pound spring in the right front and you're traveling at 2 inches, you have 200 pounds of load at that point, if it's linear, all things equal. And if you say, man, I need to go stiffer, I'm going to go to a 150-pound spring. Well, now the car can only travel that 150-pound spring 1 inch. Well, now you only have 150 pounds of load, so you actually took load away from that corner. So that's why knowing how much you're traveling is very important. And then obviously testing. So a lot easier to test on the asphalt side versus the dirt side, because you can test in more race-like track conditions. It's hard to get a dirt track prepped race-like and then when you get into wing racing, micro at the highest level in outlaw or wing sprint cars, it's not super difficult to get the thing to roll around the racetrack really nice by itself, but dirty air is where everybody's struggling to make their cars handle, and it's hard to replicate that testing. But knowing how far that thing's going to travel and how much it can travel, so that is based on a lot of factors: mechanical leverage of the car, where you have your ride height, where the wheels are spaced, what your cross weight is. All of those play a factor in how much leverage the car has to compress a certain spring. So, Kyle, when to run bump rubber on right rear on a midget track conditions? So we've been very successful at times with our progressive bump kit on the right rear of a dirt midget. Won some big races that way. The ideal scenario is a smoother, slick track. Again, your travel is much more predictable, and you can get your load right. So if you know you're traveling 2 inches and you're wanting to squeeze that bump rubber, a half of an inch, then you can set the gap an inch and a half. Where it becomes a little more difficult is it's traveling 2 inches just in one spot on the racetrack, and that's where it moved the travel indicator to. The rest of the track, it's only traveling an inch and a half. You put your bump rubber on there with an inch and a half gap, and you're only really touching it in a hole or up against a cushion. Anywhere where you can lay into that bump rubber and compress it consistently, lap after lap, you can add load to that tire and generate grip. So smoother, slick tracks is certainly where it shines. Anything with a big curb or a rough racetrack, I don't recommend it. It just becomes a little too unpredictable. So, great question. Does anybody have any questions as far as static versus dynamic, what that difference is? Happy to answer that for you. Since we got to talk with you guys last, went out to Knoxville. Got to work really hard on our wing sprint car program, which has been a work in progress for the last 2 years. We've built wing sprint car shocks since we started the company in 2009, but really kind of just became known as a non-wing and a micro and quarter midget company where we're at geographically in the country. And I love wing sprint car racing. That's what I grew up around. That's what I hope my kids want to do someday. So it's been great to get back wing sprint car racing with Jake Argo, who's a great friend of mine and worked here for a number of years. He's Tyler Courtney's crew chief. So we have a great working relationship, and we're pushing as hard as we can to really get those guys an advantage and be able to grow our wing sprint car shock program here in the next 12 to 24 months. So it was great to get to Knoxville. The Nationals are awesome. If you're a race fan and you've never been, small town of 7,000 or 8,000 people, welcome in 20,000 of their closest friends the week of the Nationals, and really is a good time, a good atmosphere, and some great racing. So if you haven't been, I recommend going. So anybody else have any questions, fire away. We're super happy to answer those. Alex, if you video your bump rubber with a GoPro, it's pretty informative. Absolutely. We have a number of videos archived that we've taken over the years when we were trying to learn and develop different bump rubber packages, knowing how much you're compressing it. For a while, we laser etched our shock bodies so we could see exactly how far it was in the bump cup and know how far we were engaging the bump rubber at all times. And that helped a bunch. So yeah, GoPros are awesome. They're so clear now. You can see them even on the darkest of racetracks, and that is very beneficial. So good point. Thanks for chiming in with that. If you go back and watch one of our older bump rubber Monday morning quarterbacks, we did it live out in the shop, and you could see us actually squeezing the bump rubber, how we rate them on the shock dyno, and it's pretty wild to see how far a foam or a polyurethane bump rubber will deform and then regain its shape, and how much hysteresis is in that bump rubber load graph. when it's generated. So, yeah, it's a two-part, probably from a couple of years ago, a two-part bump rubber video on Monday Morning Quarterback where we show some of that and why we do some of the things we do, why we run a cup when we run a foam bump rubber to prevent some of that distortion and retain the bump rubber shape as much as possible. So some good info in that video. Greg, do you decrease shock bleed when you add bump springs, rubbers, or stacks? Great question. Probably depends on what kind of racing you're doing. So shock bleed, 151 Monday Morning Quarterbacks. We've covered almost all these things in some little bit. So there is one talking about how rebound affects your race car, and we show you what shock bleed is and how it affects it. But shock bleed really is going to control the low speed portion of your graph. And so in this instance, I would assume Greg's talking about on the rebound side. As you decrease shock bleed, it really increases your low speed rebound and what a lot of people would refer to as their clamp force number. So on pavement stock cars, as you go to a harder bump rubber, you're trying to coil bind, you're trying to sit on bump springs, they run very little shock bleed, an extremely large clamp number to try to hold the platform. So when the thing falls down on soft springs, it stays level and loaded, seals that front valence off for max downforce, and keeps the thing on those bump springs, which increase front grip and overall front downforce because the front end is sealed off. In our applications, I say our core markets, micros, midget, sprint cars. If we're going to a stiffer bump rubber on the left rear and we don't think we have enough wing speed maybe to stay down on it, we would probably close up our rebound adjuster a little bit, which would decrease bleed and help keep it over there and keep it loaded. If you don't have enough low speed, if you pretended this was your bump rubber and you smashed down on it and it made 200 pounds of force and you had 150 pounds of clamp, it's just going to bounce off until it unloads the spring to where the spring has less force than the shock has rebound. So great question. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions pertaining to spring loads or anything really? We are headed to the SmackDown this week, so we'll be up there with our shock trailer supporting our non-wing sprint car customers Thursday, Friday, Saturday there, and then be on the road next Wednesday to Darlington, South Carolina for the last national quarter midget race of the year. Trying to think where we're going after that. Haven't totally planned out October. Have some openings in October potentially. We do plan to go to the Silver State Winter Nationals out in Las Vegas, that big quarter midget race in November. But yeah, local racing starting to wind down here, so we definitely want to get out and hit some more races. I would love to get out to Pennsylvania for one of their big sprint car races here at the end of the year. So yeah, open to some races. If there's a race you'd like to see us at, let us know, and we will try our best to accommodate that. So if nobody else has any questions, we'll jump off here tonight. If you've missed any of the previous 150 episodes, they're all cataloged on our YouTube page. Hours and hours and hours of good technical information, and we're certainly happy to provide that for you guys. And we're working on a bunch more cool tech video projects for the winter, and maybe even thinking about a podcast for the winter. So give you another way to get some information. But appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope you have a fantastic week, and look forward to seeing you at a racetrack soon. Take care.